Hey there, folks. This is Kevin Madison from Project Dragonfly. I hope you enjoy this podcast about Dragonfly community members doing inspiring work. If you have ideas for a guest or want to be more involved in this podcast, please feel free to directly email me. Thanks again for listening and enjoy the episode. I was pleased to host this week's conversation with Dr. Laura Abondano. She is a visiting assistant professor with Project Dragonfly at Miami. She's just wrapping up her first year and is a fantastic addition to our team. Laura is a primatologist from her home country is Colombia, and she got her PhD at the University of Austin, Texas. We cover a lot in this discussion. Her excitement over her first Earth expeditions this summer, where she's going, which she's looking forward to, and then also the origins of her interest in anthropology and primatology, how she studied initially spider monkeys and then moved on to woolly monkeys and looked into the sexual behavior of woolly monkeys, which we discuss, how she is, through her work, questioning some of Darwin's assumptions about sexual evolution. So lots of interesting nuggets of information here. And she's now with us working full-time as an instructor. Again, we're so happy to have her, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. All right, Laura, thanks for joining and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so we were just talking about how you're at the end of your first year with Dragonfly, and you've survived instructing and as a visiting assistant professor with the program. So just curious, like how's it been for you getting involved with Project Dragonfly at Miami?
No, it's been really good. I think I've mentioned to you and to other people that I came into Dragonfly kind of like having an overall idea of what Project Dragonfly was. And the more I learned, the more I realized how little I knew about Project Dragonfly because it's such a huge, massive program with so many like little intricacies here and there that are like everything is like really tailored to like helping the students succeed in the program. And then there's like the AIP and the GFP, and it's like, okay, I feel like I get a feeling of what these are, but not until I was like actually working and actually talking to students that I started like learning a little bit more like, oh, okay, this is what these two programs are. And I'm like actually super excited about this summer going into the Earth expeditions because I feel like that's going to be a really good wrap up of my first year of like putting things in perspective of like, this is what Dragonfly is.
Yes.
So I think that I'm really looking forward to the Earth expeditions. I mean, not only because it's the Galapagos and who doesn't want to go to the Galapagos, so I'm thrilled about that, but also because I think it'll be like a good summary, so to speak, of what I've been learning these last 2 semesters of what Project Dragonfly is and putting it like in a nutshell.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, you're gonna have a blast. I love that course, Galapagos. What a special thing to go to essentially 0 degrees latitude.
Yeah.
Remote way out in the middle of the ocean, it felt like to me when I went. These volcanic islands that are these natural laboratories of evolution. And like you said, seeing and meeting the students, that's just like, you're right. That's where it all kind of like comes together and you're like, okay. I almost think it would make sense to start, if we could have done it and got the logistics, like you could have started with an Earth expeditions before you started teaching online, but.
No, absolutely. Because that's actually something that I'm like, oh, I wish I had that. And you offer that possibility, but it was like
it's logistically challenging. Yeah.
And it was like
I
2
totally
days after I had planned my summer. But yeah, no, I wish I could have like done that first.
Right.
But I think there's also value of like seeing the other side, like all the courses and then having it as a wrap up of the first year. I think either way, but I'm super excited for it and meeting the students and finally having some kind of like in-person contact. Because I feel like the beauty of Dragonfly and how the online coursework is set up is that even though it's all online, it does provide that, at least for me as an instructor, it does give me like a little bit, like I feel like I know some of the students, even though I've
Yeah.
never actually, like if we've met like once or twice via Zoom, you know? And it's like, just because like how the prompts are written, it provides so much insight and people bring in so much of their personal experiences, that I was talking to one of my student leaders and I'm like, don't ask me why, but I feel that this and this student are besties. Don't ask me why, but in my
You could
head,
sense it. You could just
yeah, I'm
sense
like,
it.
I can
Yeah.
sense that they're like
Yeah.
clicking, and they're like this group that if we were in person, they would be doing all things together. And I think that's part of like how the courses are set up, that allow room for not just like academics, you know, like not just like content, but allow a lot of those personal experiences, helping, you know, like people bond even
Right.
they're miles and miles apart.
Yeah.
So I think that's really wonderful about the workshops.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's so many kindred spirits, and it's like even even if you know, like, well, this person lives on the other side of the country from me, and in reality, there's no way we're gonna like really connect much more than, but I still feel this connection, this
Mm.
kindred spirit kind of thing, and that's super powerful. I do think it is about how the program kind of filters for these people, people that are doing exciting things, thinking about the world differently. They've signed up for this graduate program. That's a totally different kind of scenario
Thing.
with
Yeah.
zoos, botanical gardens, travel, online, working. People are working all these things. People love geeking out about
Yeah.
biodiversity and species. So, okay, well, I wanted to also talk about in your bio on the Project Dragonfly website, it's got all your stuff about the various primates you've worked in different countries. So we definitely need to get into that. But at the very end, you talk about your love of tree climbing and the tree climbing course, I guess, at the time you had recently completed. And I couldn't not start things off also with asking you about, when's the last tree you climbed and what does it mean to be like, are you an expert tree climber? Like what
I
is the
wish.
terminology?
I wish I was an expert tree climber. I'm like, I would say even like beginner of a beginner tree
Mm-hmm.
climber. Because this is something that I've never done before last summer, that I took this course organized by Canopy Watch International and Alianza Natura in Colombia. And it was really wonderful because when we were going up in the trees, you can really see like, I don't know, you just have this moment of realization of like, kind of like with Dragonfly, right? Like, oh, I thought I knew the forest. I have no clue. And I only know this small percentage about the forest because I'm missing so much of what's happening that I cannot grasp from the ground, right? So it's like our instructors at the course put it in a very interesting perspective. It's like if you go to the doctor and they just look at your feet
Hmm.
and try to understand what's going on with your feet without really knowing what's happening all above of what's happening in your body, right? So it's like, we know, especially like in tropical forests, like we have all and as a primatologist in the Americas, right, most species are arboreal, and we have so many species that rarely come to the ground, right? And we're missing all that information just by kind of like being able to grasp what we can get from the ground. And sure, we have techniques, we have binoculars, we have, like
Like
some
drones
people
and
drones, or some people do fogging techniques, right? Like
hmm.
to see biodiversity in the canopy in terms of insects. But you cannot observe behavior. You cannot see the behavior of a beetle once it's dead and
Right.
on the ground. You cannot know what's happening inside a bromeliad
Mm.
unless you bring it down, and like then you lose so much information. So this experience was really eye-opening of how little we know about the forest and the canopy. And it was like really an invitation to kind of like continue pursuing it. So I come back to Oxford, right? And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep climbing the trees. And I only have a somewhat tall tree in my front yard. And that's
Okay.
like what I feel comfortable. So I kept practicing. Then winter comes, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm not an expert. And this is, I mean, as long as you do things, with care and professionally, like everything should be safe, but it is a risky activity. And I'm like, in the winter, I don't know which branches are gonna like break. I cannot assess. One of the things that they tell you is first, before you go up, you have to assess the health of the tree. And one of the things you look is like, like, do the branches have healthy leaves? Otherwise, it might be a dead branch. And like in the winter,
Right.
I'm like, I'm not an arborist. I don't know.
But
So,
nevertheless, you're climbing this tree in your front yard. I'm sure your neighbors are like,
oh yeah,
okay,
no,
what is happening here?
I'm sure people are like, what is going on? So because
Because you
of
didn't have a chainsaw. Typically around here, it's people going up to limb
exactly,
the tree, take the tree
no,
down.
it was
You're
like
just going up the tree.
I was just going up the tree with my wife and my little toddler, like just cheering me up, or I would be calling my parents on Zoom. So I bet a lot of people walking their dogs were like, what is this random person doing up in a
Oh, you should
tree?
totally do your profile picture up there or a profile video or something. You're
Yeah,
welcome to the Galapagos course from the
I
top of the
should.
tree.
I should. Yeah, no. And I've been waiting, like it's warming up a little bit. So I've been waiting for it to warm up to kind
Mhm.
of like go up again, but like right now, I mean, in the end of the semester with all the things happening, I just haven't found the time to do so. But I'm super excited to get back into it.
Well, I think you bring up the whole idea of like, it's like a doctor only looking at the feet. And I started thinking, well, it's almost like a doctor only looking at like the calves or the shins because the feet are also hidden, or even the
Yeah,
legs, you could say, of the
exactly. Yeah,
trees
no,
in
you're
the
right.
mycorrhizal fungus and the root
Yes.
structure, which
Yeah. So
there's been all this
that's
great research
a
about.
whole other world, right? What's happening in the soil, what's happening beneath that is allowing that tree to rise up, right? And
To
support so much life above the canopy. No plans to
totally.
go underground yet, but
It's okay. Yeah, start your burrowing project as well. But I love how like we as humans, we kind of have our own experiences. And once you step a little bit outside of our sort of standard mode of movement, right?
yeah.
Walking, terrestrial walking, right? And you get into the arboreal setting. Or like I was thinking for some reason about in New York City, our Bronx Zoo AIP program goes out on kayaks into the Hudson River. And it's like
Oh, cool.
for people that live in New York, it's kind of rare to, I think, to get out on the water, these bodies of water, and see the city in this whole different way, from this different perspective, in an aquatic kind of
Yeah.
setting. I feel like as little kids, we delve into other modes
Mhm.
more than we do as adults, whether it's swimming or climbing trees as a little kid and just seeing things in a different way. And I think we do miss that as we get older.
Yeah. I do
So I
have to
think,
say,
yeah,
tree climbing feels like I'm playing, like I'm a little kid. So that's the other part is like, sure, we can talk about the research all we want, but also on a personal level, it's just like how cool that I'm climbing up a tree, like in my 30s, I'm doing work, like
well, the rule in our family was always, because my kids would always be like, Dad, help me get up the tree, help me get up. And we'd be like, you got to be able to get up on your own and get down because if you get them up and they keep going up, and then
right?
you have to go do something else. They got to show they can get down and they can get
Yeah.
up. But there is that period where they need a little boost. But anyway, so let's get into the primate research, all of this. And I know we could start with spider monkeys or really woolly monkeys, any of them. But I feel like your first connection was spider monkeys through your
Mhm.
undergraduate work, perhaps. So maybe we could go back to that and just talk about how that all started for you.
Yeah, no, like I have it's funny that when I say I'm a primatologist, a lot of people are like, oh, Jane Goodall. And I'm like, yeah, yeah. But honestly, like full disclosure, like I didn't start reading about Jane Goodall like much later on in my life. A lot of people are like, oh, I was reading Jane Goodall since I was very little. And I was very excited. I didn't even know I wanted to be a biologist until like it came in Colombia. It's kind of different, I feel like, how it is here. And it's like you turn 18, you have to decide what you want to do for the rest of your life. So your career really like you go straight into like a 5-year program, and it's like before you enroll, I think things have changed a little bit and now there's like more flexibility, but it's like what department do you want to enroll in? and you have to kind of like declare a major right away. So I was like, I don't know. Honestly, I have no clue what I want to do for the rest of my life. All I know is that I love being outside, and then I started exploring like, okay, and something that led me to that, I think I was part of the International Scouts Organization movement. So I was camping. Yeah. And again, I wouldn't say in Colombia, in most parts of the world, other than the US, there's no like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, it's just Scouts. So you go camping with co-ed teams, and like whatever girls are doing is the same as what boys are doing, in the sense that, like the activities is like build a bridge that can support your entire troop, and everyone has to do it.
Sounds fun. Yeah.
It's awesome. And I think that those activities are also kind of like what led me to love being outdoors. So when it came to like, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? I'm like, okay, I have some options. I love nature. I also love talking to people. So I'm like, I don't know, maybe biology or anthropology. And then I'm like, well, let's get out of the physics and chemistries and maths first. So I enrolled into bio, and then eventually I started taking some anthro courses, which I minored in anthropology. But then in bio, I was like, oh, okay, I love this. So I started like getting, the first semester, I'm like, okay, I made the right decision. And then, I don't know, it was like halfway through, I was really into behavior in general. I didn't know what species, but I was very interested in behavior. And every single project that came up, I'm like, I want to understand how individuals are interacting with one another, so everything from behavior. And it was in one field trip that we went to a place called Serranía de las Quinchas in the Magdalena Middle River Valley in Colombia, that I saw this mom spider monkey with an infant. And, like we were there and people were like, oh, look at the monkeys. And I was like, just thrilled I'm like, okay, I knew I liked monkeys, but I really like monkeys. And I remember,
it was that it was a mother and an infant. Something about that was the interaction, right?
Absolutely. So I'm like, and I'm very close to my mom. So it was also like seeing them interact. I'm like, this is really cool. And then it was like, the group was like, okay, let's head out to our other thing. I'm like, but why can't we stay here? Like, I just want to stay here. So that was kind of like my first time that I'm like, okay, I'm really into primates, kind of like, because I felt that connection. And that has kind of like stuck with me throughout my career, because then eventually I got an opportunity to work in similar, like in a place called San Juan, that is also a different place, but it's also in the Magdalena Middle River Valley, where I ended up doing my thesis with Andres Link, who is a primatologist in Colombia. And then it was the same, like first week, like I went there kind of like for a few days. And then first week, I'm like, Andres, I want to do my thesis with you. This is what I want to do. And spider monkeys were just like, in one of those moments that captured kind of like my heart, so to speak, was another mother infant moment where like the little baby was having trouble jumping between one tree to the next. And you could see that like the mom kept going, and then the baby was like crying. And I'm anthropomorphizing 100% here, but it felt like the mom was like, oh, okay, I'll come back for you. It went back and did like the bridge between two branches, and the little baby walked over the mom. And at that point, I'm like, this is what I want to do kind of like for the rest of my life.
So the mom just stretched her body and let the infant walk across it. Like you sometimes see ants do this kind of behavior.
Yeah. Exactly. Wow. So, and then they kept going. And at that moment, it was like one of also those, like, I don't know, like you feel that connection of like, wow, like I kept telling people, like people say like how much monkeys are like us. And then it's just like, well, we are primates. So understandably, and that's actually kind of like what led me to study like biological anthropology. So to kind of like understand that how close or like how similar we are with primates, but also understanding the uniqueness. And I don't want to say uniqueness as like we are special, but how each species has also their own behaviors, even though we are
Right.
connected phylogenetically and we share a lot of similar behaviors. Not only there's uniqueness in the species, but when you talk culturally, right, there is uniqueness within each culture in humans, also in primates and other species. So understanding those behaviors and how individuals are interacting with one another is kind of like what led me to this primatological journey. And eventually, like, even though I've always been interested like in mother-infant relationships,
Uh-huh.
but ultimately I noticed that like all my grad school projects were always related to like sex and
Uh-huh.
sexual behaviors.
Right.
And that's kind of like what has led me since grad school is like looking more at the reproductive behaviors of the woolly monkeys and in general among primates, what is making individuals mate with another
Right.
individual.
And
uh
it's and let's definitely get into that. And I just think it's so wonderful. I just want to say that your undergraduate journey, even though it had to be prescribed from a very, like you said, 18 years old, you had to choose, I guess you had to choose biology, right? You couldn't specialize in, say, primatology at that point,
yeah,
think,
no.
right? But I think for some, they are excited about life and studying life, and they
Mm-hmm.
think biology, it's a study of life. But then they get to college and they realize that's a lot of labs where you're looking at like pickled specimens and dissecting dead
Yeah,
things, and it actually can turn them away. And how cool that you had this international scouts experience, I imagine, when you were younger, but that was very positive. And then also had these like field experiences as a part of your undergraduate that actually let you see living,
yeah,
breathing primates and
that
mother
is
infant interactions,
the beauty and the absolute privilege of being born in one of the most biodiverse countries in the world.
Right.
Because every semester, like you just hop on a bus 45 minutes to an hour, and then you are in a forest, or to see primates, like it would be like 2 or 3 hour ride, and there's like, yeah, so it's just like literally in your backyard you have so much biodiversity that
Right.
um it is a privilege. It is an absolute
And
privilege
did you
to
grow
grow
up
up.
in a city in Colombia,
Yes,
or okay? Where
yeah,
where did you grow up?
in
And
Bogota, which
okay,
is
sure.
10 million.
Yeah.
Growing up it was 8 million people. Now we're at 10, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a
Wow.
huge city, which again, like even I feel like I had that privilege of like just hopping on a bus for an hour or 2 or 3 and seeing monkeys and like a bunch of other things. Uh, but a lot of people that grow up like in more rural areas, like not in such an urban center of 10 million people, have monkeys coming to their backyards.
Right.
So that is pretty amazing. And I do think it's like what you learn out over the years, right, is like understanding that you don't have to go far away. And this resonates a lot. Like I remember like I saw something from David Attenborough at one, that it's like, yeah, you don't have to necessarily travel far to see all
Hmm.
the beauty and biodiversity around you. And it's just like, yeah, you just need to look in your backyard. But your backyard might be very different if you live in Oxford, Ohio, than uh, rural
Okay.
Colombia.
So now you're in Oxford, Ohio. I mean, how do you get your primate fix? Do you go to the Cincinnati Zoo, or do you just, you travel back to Colombia, and I think you're also going to Peru
Yeah,
periodically?
and Ecuador.
Okay.
So for my undergrad, I worked mainly in Colombia, but then since I finished, I worked a little bit with spider monkeys before with the woolies in a place called Tiputini Biodiversity Station in
Hmm.
Amazonian Ecuador. That's where I did kind of like my dissertation field research. So I still go back and forth there kind of like once a year. And also recently I've started collaborating with some Peruvian conservationists that have this area that they're protecting for like kind of like in, how do you say, promoting ecotourism, but also kind of like scientific research. And kind of in the tropical Andes in the Cusco department of Peru, where there also happens to be woolly monkeys, a different subspecies than the one I study. But I'm kind of like really excited to start working with them, kind of like starting from scratch with following these woolly monkeys. It's also a place full of waterfalls where, you know, if a monkey goes through, you know, I want to survive. So
sounds romantic to the outsider, but I'm sure
exactly.
it's a little
But at the
precarious when you're
same
actually doing it.
time, parallel to our research there, what we want to do is like work with the communities there, or like what we're starting to do is working with people there, kind of like trying to figure out how we can integrate them more into these scientific initiatives that we are starting to develop. So, so they can be the future scientists that are studying the species right there in their backyards, you know?
Right. I saw a title of a paper in Google Scholar. I was looking at your profile in Google Scholar, academic profile, and there's a title called Community-Based Strategies to Promote Primate Conservation in Agricultural Landscapes, Lessons Learned from Case Studies in South America. So that seems perhaps to be related to what you're talking about, wanting to do with this subspecies in Cusco.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
So that chapter is a chapter that we published recently at the beginning of this year, and it was like a big collaboration between different international scholars from the UK, from Colombia, from Ecuador, and it was kind of like a compilation of different case studies of some of my colleagues who have been working towards primate conservation, but in mostly agricultural landscapes, you know, like very human dominated landscapes, in particular related to cattle ranching, you know, or some sort of like plantations that, you know, like we keep saying like, oh, okay, we cannot destroy the forest and have plantations because all the primates are going to go extinct. Which is true. If we continue to do that at the rate that we keep doing it, or following the same practices that we're doing mostly about, I always forget it, monocropping or monoculture.
I think you could say both, but monoculture, yeah.
Monoculture, right? Kind of like what the case studies are highlighting is, in particular, we have a few case studies there. One of my favorite projects from one of my colleagues, it's called the Washu project in Ecuador. And they pair up with different local communities, and they started like kind of like having this sustainable cacao production, where they pair them up with people that pay a higher price for their products, for, you know, like kind of protecting forests. And it's really an initiative led by the community, right? Rather than they're just kind of like facilitators to kind of like establish those conversations. And they've shown like, yeah, like you can still have primates kind of like in these agricultural landscapes. People need to eat, people need to have money to provide for their families, you know, and you cannot just go ahead and being like, oh, well, you cannot cut down the trees. Sure, but if there's no other alternatives, what do you do? So it's kind of like shifting mentalities into how can we do this, but in a more sustainable way, you know? So kind of like it's those experiences. Another of my colleagues brought up like this project that there is in Colombia about cattle ranching, and how, again, by implementing sustainable practices, you can still have these corridors that connect different forests. And if you can kind of like talk to cattle ranchers and telling them like, I'm not asking you to like not cut down any trees, but you can leave this strip of forest to allow species to move between these larger forest fragments. And by that, you still have your products, you know, you still can continue doing what your economic activity is, but you just have to leave this very small percentage of your land uncut, and you're going to have a huge impact on biodiversity. So it's always about those trade-offs and understanding different stakeholders. And also something that we talk about in the chapter is like, how there's no one solution fits all type of thing, like it really depends on the cultural context. Even within the same cultural context is different if you talk to a farmer who has like huge piece of land versus someone that has like 3 hectares. So
And
that
that's,
was kind of like the goal of the chapter.
I love that. And it's so true that everything depends in ecology and conservation, but it's kind of frustrating because it would be nice to just like have a prescribed, I think sometimes as
Oh,
ecologists, we're like,
yeah.
have that envy of physics, which has these like laws and these, constants, mathematical constants, and gravity kind of works. Well, you get into relativity and such, but mostly works the same in most contexts. But conservation, it's like you are right. There's no one size fits all issue. But at the same time, like you're saying, leave the general principle of trying to leave something when you can. And it also will have the benefits not only to the primates and the corridors and things moving through, but maybe erosion benefits or pollination.
Exactly.
Um,
So, and that's the part of it, right? It's like not just come down being like, you cannot come and do this, but like, actually, if you implement these things, like
mm,
you're also going to receive huge benefit from these ecosystem services that you are allowing your piece of land to have by kind of like not cutting down every single tree just to, have a grassland that is used for cattle grazing. So it's really about like listening and understanding what people needs are, but also like definitely education, because I didn't know these things until I studied them. Why would I expect them to know these things, which a lot of time people do just because they've been in that land for many years. But a lot of time all people have heard is like the what I would call like like the traditional methods, or like the custom methods for increasing productivity, which are very different to what sustainable agriculture would look like. So it's kind of like finding that balance and really like establishing a good relationship and having good connections with the people that you work with, which is, again, it's not necessarily what we are doing yet in Peru, because we're
mm,
just kind of like starting the project, but it's kind of like we are trying to start this project with those
with that in
principles.
mind. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think it can maybe slow you down at the start because it is relationship building and listening, like you're saying, but maybe even if it slows you down, it might give you more dividends later in the form of insights, awareness, and certainly
Absolutely.
people willing to help you and move things forward. So I did want to ask, so we kind of glazed over. So the woolly monkeys and their behavior, their sexual behavior, which you talked about, and that, so we got to get back into that. So tell us
Yeah.
what are some of the most interesting or things you found that you didn't expect with the sexual behavior of the woolly monkeys?
So it's interesting that you ask, because I feel like that could be described in. I recently went to a conference that's called American Association of Biological Anthropologists. And I gave a talk that it's been in the works for, I'm going to say, the last couple of years. I was very scared of giving it because
Hmm.
the title starts with question in Darwin.
Oh,
Yeah. So
okay.
I was like,
Questioning Darwin. Okay.
questioning Darwin. Who am I to question Darwin? And it's the full title, I think it is Questioning Darwin, How Woolly Monkey Sexuality kind of like challenges longstanding ideas of sexual selection proposed by Darwin and kind of like followed by other scholars. And this has been kind of like the beauty of studying sexual behaviors and reproductive strategies among the woolies, is that,
Hmm.
like we have this idea.
I love that you just call them woolies among the woolies.
Oh,
That's
I mean,
great.
we're friends.
Yeah, yeah.
Woolly monkey can get
Yeah,
long.
no, I'm all for it. Let's talk about
And
woolies.
sometimes when I'm talking about woolies and spiders, I have to like clarify like woolies and spider monkeys, because then people get
Ah, that does
confused.
seem important.
Um, But
Mhm.
yeah, like they teach us these ideas of like, okay, when we're talking about sexual selection, it's male competition, like for the females, and then females are like kind of like passively waiting and selecting for the males to court them and
Mhm.
kind of like choose the best male among them, and then like what I was telling in the talk is like this was interesting. And I pulled quotes from Darwin's book on sexual selection, which
Mhm.
I can give to you, but it is rough to read that 150 years after um, Darwin published these
Right.
pieces.
Right.
And I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so I started working with the woolies, and then I'm like, oh, this is interesting. It's the females that are kind of like going into the males, kind of like soliciting copulations. It is the females that are harassing other copulations, kind of like competing between themselves, for the
Mm.
males. The males are rejecting copulations. They're like one of my favorite examples. It's hilarious. I was watching this monkey, a male, and then a female comes into contact, right? And starts kind of like tapping the male on the back and kind of like soliciting him for a copulation. So
Mm.
they do this facial gesture that it's called teeth chattering. So they go
Mm.
like, and then usually then that results or is followed by a copulation. And then the female goes to the male and keeps tapping his back. The male gets up a little bit, moves like a couple meters away, goes back to sleep. Then the female goes back to the male, and taps again. And this happened like 3 times until like the male like kind of like turned around, copulated with the female, and then went back to sleep.
Okay.
So like showing like, and when you read Darwin's work, it's like there is no doubt that males will compete for the females. And it is always the males that are fighting and eager to copulate with the females. So it's just like, oh, okay, woolies are different. And in general, like those behaviors is what I love about them, that they kind of like to some extent contradict or challenge these
Now,
general notions of like, oh, male competition, and this is just
right.
what nature is like. I'm like, sure, that's our nature if you look at these species, but not all species. And what's been problematic, not just in primatology, but in across biology or behavioral biology, is that we have focused so much on a few model species, and we
Mm.
are kind of like extrapolating our understanding of sexual behavior, including humans, based on these few species. But as more and more research starts coming up, and we're
Mhm.
like, oh, but there's this exception, and then this exception. Oh, and also this exception. I'm like, are these exceptions, or are
Right.
we just like very, very biased? And something that I close that talk with, and I think this is really important to acknowledge, is how much the cultural context matters. I'm not saying Darwin was wrong and he was
Right.
just a racist and a sexist scholar. Where did he grow up?
Mm-hmm.
He grew up in this Victorian era where like, female were supposed to be cared for, and females were delicate, and female was like their role were to take care of the kids and domestic duties, so understandably he was influenced by this cultural context. And that is for me kind of like an invitation of like, for many biologists that are like, oh, but
Right.
this is true facts, is like, it is, but it's also biased by a lot of the cultural upbringings of many people.
Right. And
And
it's interesting because I think he was, and I haven't read some of his work in quite some time, but I think he was looking at some of these adaptations, these physical adaptations and
mhm,
behaviors, things like peacock feathers
yeah.
and antlers, these enormous that are sort of counterintuitive from a standard
Hmm.
natural selection standpoint. Like, why would natural selection select for this huge amount of feathers to make it hard to,
Yeah.
fly around? And so, sexual selection was the explanation. But you're right, definitely colored and flavored with the time, the notions, the cultural notions of the time that he was living in, that Victorian era, in terms of the explanation, and maybe skipping some of the counter examples that are out there, that you're now highlighting and finding, that are just important for us to consider. So I'm curious with the woolly monkeys. I mean, are they polygynous, polyandrous? Like what is going on there? Are they monogamous? Just sort of, and you might want to define some of those terms in case people are.
Yeah, so they are characterized by a mouthful, which is called polygynandrous. So basically, it's fun all with all.
Okay.
Right? So males
Free
mate
love.
with, yeah, no, I love woolies because it's all like, human nature is about war and this and that. I'm like, oh, but woolies are like the hippies of the forest. I call them literally the hippies of the forest because they have this mating system, polygynandrous mating system, where males mate with multiple females, females mate with multiple males. My dissertation in particular was like, something that I wanted to understand was like, okay, which males are females mating with? Because when we look at the genetic data, something that is interesting is that even though females are mating with multiple males in the group, it's typically one or two males in the group who tend to be like the larger ones. So like it still kind of follows these ideas that our siring genetically are the fathers of most of the offspring. So I'm like, okay, we've seen in other primate species that females use kind of like these strategies of kind of like confusing paternity, which is basically like, I'll mate with all the males, but I will just mate with this male when I'm at my peak fertility window, right? So when I'm ovulating, right? So that is the male that sire or that fathers the kid, but other males might think that they are the fathers, so they might be less likely to be aggressive with the infants, be more willing to share food, be more willing to groom or engage in social interactions, because even though they don't know that that is their kid, it might be.
Right.
And that little window of might be enough to kind of like prevent infanticide, for example, which they've noticed in some other species, in langurs, for example.
So this was your hypothesis, right?
So this was my hypothesis.
Okay.
And for anyone listening that's doing a dissertation or a thesis out there, embrace your hypotheses being thrown down and to the ground, because nothing will ever, I'm not going to say will ever, usually things don't work out the way that you expect to, or like they're just not like it. So what I did was like I collected fecal samples, not only for the genetic analyses but for hormone analyses. So basically what I did was I mapped the menstrual cycle of woolly monkeys, kind of like to compare it with humans, right? And what I looked is like, okay, are females mating with particular males when they're ovulating or during that time period, and perhaps mating with the other males outside of that fertility window? No, there was zero pattern. Like, statistically, even before doing any statistics, I looked at the graphs and I'm like, well, this tells me nothing. So one thing that we might think, right, is that there's different possibilities, right? One of them is that there's sperm competition among the males. So that's the other beauty about woolies. Males don't necessarily compete with one another for copulations or in mating context. You can have a male, like copulating with a female, and then another male 5 meters away,
right,
just resting and not.
No jealousy.
Sperm competition might be a possibility, and
can you just explain? So I don't know how long is sperm remain viable, and by competition, what do you mean? I mean, competition for fertilizing the egg, but is there anything else the sperm are doing to each other to block each other?
No, it would be more like,
it's more
kind
just
of like which is the best swimmer.
Okay, gotcha.
Right, when you're talking about sperm competitions, like who's the best swimmer, or like
the best swimmer, and probably the best at remaining viable for potentially for a longer time period.
So this is kind of like part one of the possibilities, right? It would be sperm competition, where perhaps the male that is siring or fathering most of the kids, it just happens that either they have their sperm is better quality, so they can swim faster, or they have like physiological adaptations that like, like make them more successful at fertilizing the egg. It might just be that these larger males have a higher sperm load, so just if we think in numbers, more sperm is more possibilities for fertilizing an egg. On the other side, there might also be what we would call cryptic female choice, right? Where female, like there is some sort of selection for different type of sperm in the female's vaginal tract, right? So some of the research, or like in humans, we know like in the cervix, there's so many layers, right? Of kind of like sperm has to go through so many barriers, not just physical barriers, but like, like pH levels, and the cervix have like little pockets where like
temperature, I would imagine.
Temperature, sperm can get like encapsulated in these little pockets, not making all the way through the tubes, right? So it never gets to fertilize the egg. So that's another thing that has changed over the last few years. It's not just like, oh, if it's not male-male competition, they're competing through sperm, right? But also, and that was something that several researchers came up to me after the talk, and they're like, oh, have you thought about cryptic female choice? And that question, because I didn't include it in my talk, but it was very reflective in the sense that I'm like, why have I not thought about female cryptic choice? I kind of like had it in the radar, but I didn't kind of like put it in as a potential likely possibility. And it's again because of these biases that we have and the way that we are taught biology, right? That kind of like shows us only a particular side of things, which tends to be dominated by who is in academia. And historically, there's been one particular demographic that has dominated academia. And we've only heard a dominating narrative. But as we bring more people providing different perspectives, we can get a more holistic approach of what are the different possibilities of what might be happening. And one of them could be like, and I saw a talk during the conference where there are some primates that when you look at their pH is changing around the time of ovulation. There is being selection for different sperm depending on which male those females copulate with. So there might be this cryptic female choice happening, which unfortunately, both in terms of sperm competition or female cryptic choice, working with wild primates is really difficult to study, because just to get a sperm sample from a monkey that's moving in a tree 25 meters above, and there's a lot of foliage, a lot of things in between, it's really hard to get a sample. And I also cannot measure the pH of female that's moving
seems
around.
a little challenging for sure.
So we can only hypothesize these things until somehow we develop some technology where we can assess those things. So yeah, no, like I think what I love about my work with woolly monkeys, I love woolies and I want to see them every day of my life if I could. But what I find more valuable is that it has helped me to shift some perspectives in what have I been taught?
Right.
Who have I been taught by? And what is the research that has been presented to me as, like important papers? And how much of the literature I'm not aware that provides these different perspectives, but that are perhaps voices that are masked by these dominating authors in the field, So this has really forced me to not just think this in terms of the woolies, but be a lot more critical and questioning on when I'm reading any sort of research, not just in terms of like reproductive behaviors, primatology, and sexuality, but in general, who's writing that paper, what is their background, and what are some potential biases, just like Darwin, that might influence their interpretations of the natural world. And
I
that
think
has been key.
Yeah, in anthropology and primatology, it just seems it must be such a dangerous thing to impart our own sort of cultural beliefs in the moment without even knowing, subconsciously perhaps. But yeah, you're being aware of that and it is a reason for all the things we need to do with DEI and diversity in science, and all different fields, to have those different perspectives, so we don't get stuck on these narratives that are kind of linear and oversimplified, right?
Exactly.
I saw another paper you have, well, two more I kind of wanted to bring up. One is on the same-sex behaviors in the woolies. I think that was a paper. It might have been a research presentation.
It was a poster, yeah.
Okay, a poster, cool. Well, it would be interesting just to hear a little bit about that. And then, since we're talking about diversity and equity and inclusion in primatology, and you have a paper, or maybe it was also a poster or presentation, I'm not sure, on that topic as well. So yeah, maybe you can touch on those two areas.
Yeah, well, on the same-sex behaviors, that was another poster that it was just kind of like let's put this information out there because people are not doing that. And that is something that, like this narrative and things are changing, but you still have people say like, oh, these homosexual behaviors are not natural, they are unnatural. And this is kind of like this has been kind of like my projection throughout my career, right? Like I started this because I wanted to see how similar we were to other primates. And now I'm like, oh, okay, what we see in primates doesn't necessarily have to explain how humans behave. We can use it to kind of like gain some perspective and understanding, but we cannot, like you were saying, oversimplify things and say like, oh, well, we see this in nature, and then this is what happens, so and so. But people continue to do that, right? And what I like about this paper is it's kind of like putting out there, like, these are natural behaviors, like same-sex individuals are still engaging in sexual behaviors with one another, And what was really interesting is that there's more and more things coming up, especially as you get more queer scholars in the sciences, right? That are like, this is happening, let's put this out there. But there's still a lot of gaps in information among a lot of species that still lead some people to say like, well, these are unnatural behaviors, and oh, okay, fine, penguins are an exception, or this other species is an exception. And then when you look at across the animal taxa, there are same-sex sexual behaviors all across, right? And it's not just a few exceptions. So all I wanted to do with this paper was kind of like put it out there, like this is also happening with the woolies. When I looked at the literature, there was nothing about the woolies, right? So this is another data point. If anyone goes out there and does a meta-analysis, now there is a point to say like, this is also happening in woolly monkeys, kind of like to add to that pool of information of different species that are engaging in these same-sex sexual behaviors. And what was very interesting is that when I was presenting this poster, I had a lot of researchers come to me and saying like, oh yeah, no, I've also seen something similar, or like, I've also seen that at my field site. I'm like, oh, have you published about it? And they're like, well, no, because it's just a few cases. And it's just like, but that's information that is not out there, And the more, and I think we have come to a point where, like maybe 100 years ago, biologists lived many of our dreams that was just to be naturalist and go out there and just describe what they saw in nature. And it's like, oh, but we have to have statistical analyses. And it's like, oh, and we've got so much into the data and the points and the effect size and then how much and the p-value that we have forgot to kind of like just describe in general what we see in nature. That sometimes going back to that naturalist, like activity and describing it and putting it out there is important. And a lot of journals are acknowledging that. I think it's Animal Behavior that is now has a section of like kind of like you don't have to, like anecdotal information that I cannot do a statistical analysis with the 5 or 6 records I have about same-sex behavior, but what I can tell you is like, I saw 5 instances or 6, I don't remember, but in all instances, what was interesting is that there was always at least one subadult or juvenile individual. I'm like, okay, maybe this is kind of like a learning behavior, You don't know. Maybe they're kind of like copying what the adults are doing and practicing, mounting
Right.
behaviors. We don't know. We have a very small sample size, but not until people go out in the field and start recording, writing down these weird, so to speak, behaviors, or like, I don't know if people are going to be seeing this or just listening, but I'm like making air quotes with my hands.
Yes.
I don't want people to think that I'm saying that these are weird behaviors, but that's how they've been categorized. Not until people start actually writing these down. Because a lot of time they don't even get on paper, it's just like, oh yeah, I saw it, but that's just a random behavior, so I'm not going to write it down in my field notebook. And that never goes noticed. So that was kind of like my goal with this paper, is put it out there. Woolly monkeys are also doing this, like many other species.
Right.
And this is a possibility. There's always a
Yeah.
subadult. It might be a learning behavior. We need more information to kind of like draw any conclusions on that end.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, and thanks I'm sure at times when you publish things, you're like, I don't know, but you feel that need to, like you said, share the story, share what you're seeing, be that data point. But some of these things that are connected to like cultural issues, and it's easy. I would feel like concerned, like, oh my goodness, like, are people going to take this and politicize this or make this some sort of statement that's just not helpful or whatever? And I think it's great you're putting it out there. So what about the DEI in primatology, that work?
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
want to share
so
about
that
that?
is that is a kind of like a joint effort. I'm part of the DEIA, so Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee
Mm,
of the American Society of Primatologists. And one thing that we wanted to do with this abstract that you saw there, it was kind of like a round table, so there's, just like in publications and in academia, historically, there have been communities that have not been brought into the conversation. And not until we kind of like what we've been talking all along, if we don't listen, we don't
mm,
know how to make things better. Right. And as a society, the American Society of Primatologists is trying to do better, as we should all be doing. Right. And then what we put together, this was like a roundtable for a conference that happened last year, which basically, first things first, right? Start a conversation. And this is what our goal was. It was like, okay, we're open to this conversation. We want to hear what people's concerns are, like what people would like to see more in the society, and kind of like have a better idea of how to serve the members of the society in a more inclusive manner.
mm.
And inclusivity, like we want to make sure that it's not just like visible diversity and being visibly inclusive or equitable, but also understanding that there's a lot of times that a lot of people are struggling with other issues that are not visible, so that's why one of the bigger efforts, at least last year, was like to change our committee from DEI to
Mm,
DEIA, to
mhm.
make sure that it's accessible for people with disabilities, right? And disabilities can look in many different ways. So one of the things that we have been doing is, like, for example, at least for conferences, I don't know who of the people that are listening have been to an academic conference, but they can be exhausting. They are
Mhm,
draining. You're there
mhm.
from 8 in the morning until 10 p.m. usually. And sometimes you just need a space to kind of like go and chill. And
Right.
hotels usually don't have that. And you have people running everywhere. And then you end up having people having to go, like into the bathroom. Or so one of the things was providing these quiet spaces,
Mhm.
like where people could go and decompress. People that have sensory, I forget the name. I apologize. Like
Yes,
yeah,
overload. Yeah.
yes, they get
Mhm.
sensory overload, like whether they make use or not of this place, know that it's available,
Right.
so those are
I like
little
that. Yeah.
things that sometimes people like me that perhaps, sure, I get overwhelmed, but I don't necessarily feel like I need to go decompress, but some people do, you know?
Right.
So I might not think about those things. So this roundtable was that opening up the conversation and being like, what do you need? You
Mm-hmm.
know, how would you feel more invited into this society in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
conference, or like, you know, opportunities, different things that might look in many different ways that we might just not see because it's not our life experience. I can tell you everything about what it is to be a Latina, you know, doing a PhD or working here in academia in the US, but I cannot speak for many people that have other kind of like challenges
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that they can do. So again, this roundtable, it was like opening up that
That's
space
wonderful.
to
Yeah,
have
that's
that
great.
conversation.
Opening that up. And I think, yeah, conferences can be completely overwhelming for sure. I think it's like, it's a good reminder, anyone thinking about it, you're not going to be able to see every talk, and
I
you got
know.
to look out for yourself and just see what you can see, connect with who you can, and also view it hopefully as a break from your everyday life. But yeah, that's more challenging for some people than others. So acknowledging that
Exactly.
and listening and thinking about that. And then I also think for primates, being pretty much, with some exceptions, a tropical, subtropical distributed group
Mhm.
worldwide, the DEI issue seems especially important to make sure there's a greater balance of known, well-known primatologists from the
Exactly.
countries where those primates are living. I
Mhm.
mean, like you said, everyone loves Jane Goodall. Everyone can name Jane Goodall and
Exactly.
Diane Fossey, and those individuals did wonderful things, right? But how many people can actually name a primatologist that actually is from one of those countries where
Exactly.
those species live? It's it needs to change, and that's a bigger
Mhm.
issue.
Yeah. So one of the things we want to do with the American Society of Primatologists is that it really becomes the American Society of Primatologists and not the North American Society of
Oh, yeah,
Primatologists.
that seems important to start.
Because
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, and then when you see the membership is usually people from the US or Europe
Mm,
or Canada, and it's like, okay, but where's all the people from the Americas that are actually like doing the groundwork every day? You know, so it's like
right.
this is one of our major goals, is kind of like to increase opportunities, you know, and it's not just like, oh, we want to open it up, you know.
Mm,
People in Colombia, if you ask for a membership that is $80, you know, that can be minimum salary for someone in
mhm.
many countries, right? That cannot afford. So it's understanding also like the different, and again, it all goes back to context and understanding a context, and that not one size fits all
Right.
situation seems to be the theme of this conversation.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of come full circle, and I feel like we could keep talking for a long time, but I also want to be mindful of your time. I mean, thank you so much, first of all,
Yeah.
for sharing this wonderful world of the woolies, the spiders, tree climbing, seeing all these unique perspectives, and listening. And I guess one sort of fun question I'll ask you just is about your favorite desserts, just totally out of the blue, but just I like to ask something personal and important, like your favorite dessert,
Oh
as
my
something
God.
final here
Yeah.
for us.
Um, I'm just gonna say anything chocolate. If it has
So
chocolate,
yeah,
yeah,
it's there.
yeah.
I
I
got
think
it.
it's like I'm going with the easy answer, but it's true. It's like I don't have one thing. It's like if it has chocolate, I'll eat
So
it.
you're not gonna like, some people are like, oh, I will never touch like Nestle's, but I'll go with Cadbury, or you talked about actually being on these various cacao plantations where maybe perhaps you had some exposure to some like more
Yeah,
unique
that wasn't me.
homegrown.
That was my
Oh,
colleagues, which
okay.
their chocolate is absolutely delicious. But you can give
What
me
is it? Do you know what it's called, or can
it's
anyone?
it has the label of their project, so it's a washu, so it's not like a huge thing, and so it's mostly sold in Ecuador. And then if they have people, for example, I brought some here to the US, and I've sold like kind of like word of mouth type of thing.
Gotcha.
You
Okay.
won't find it like at a Kroger or
Not even an internet search, maybe, where.
so. Yeah, no, like I'll eat dark chocolate, milk chocolate, white chocolate, which a lot of chocolate people are
That's
like,
where I
"Oh,
draw the line.
white
I
chocolate."
got
I'm like,
stuck
oh
with
no,
some of
bring
these
it in.
Hershey's white chocolate
Oh,
kisses,
I'll
and
eat real and fake chocolate all along, as long as
love it.
again, all it needs to be is like chocolate. Yeah.
I hear you. I'm with you. I'm with you on that. Well, thank you again so much, Lara.
Yeah.
Thanks for all the work you've done, and just being a part of the Dragonfly team at the end of your first year. Hopefully, many more to come, and we're lucky to have you. And thanks again for joining on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Kevin.
Hi there, folks. Just one more thing before you head on out. If you have a moment, as I mentioned at the beginning, I would love to hear in what ways you are finding this podcast useful, how you listen, what you would like to hear more of, less of, etc. Please feel free to send me any and all feedback, any ideas for guests, etc. to Kevin Madison at my email, which is mattiskc@miamioh.edu. That's spelled MATTESKC @miamioh.edu. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.